In the summer of 1990, Marcus Hill left his grandmother's house in East St. Louis after a mysterious phone call and vanished into the night. 10 minutes later, the alley leading to State Street was completely silent. No screams, no struggle, no one saw Marcus come back. The family reported it to the police, but there were no clues, no vehicle recorded, and no witness willing to come forward. The whole city whispered that the 17-year-old might have run away or been lured somewhere. Then, in 2024, when the Mississippi River receded, a rusted license plate surfaced, unlocking the door to a sedan that had been submerged since 1990. A sedan Marcus never should have gotten into. A sedan that may have carried East St. Louis' biggest secret for 35 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Summer nights in East St. Louis in 1990 were filled with an atmosphere anyone who lived there knew well, heavy, humid, like an invisible fog, settling over every roof and street. The street lights on State Street flickered in the hot wind, pulsing faintly then flaring up again, as if fighting to stay alive, reflecting off the dusty windows of the old row houses lining both sides of the road. The sound of trains on the Southern Rail branch echoed in long bursts, forming the unwilling soundtrack for a neighborhood so used to silence, you could hear conversations from porches several houses away. No one on that street knew that this particular evening would become a marker they'd talk about for decades. Inside his grandmother's small house, Marcus Hill, 17 years old, slim build, a kind face that made people like him instantly, was getting ready to step out. He had just taken a call on the landline, a call no one else overheard except for Marcus replying softly and calmly, "I'll come, just for a little bit." He didn't say who he was meeting or where. He simply hung up, slipped on a light jacket despite the heat, and told his grandmother he'd be back soon. There was no worry on Marcus's face, nothing to suggest he was hiding something serious, just a teenager heading out on what seemed like an ordinary night. When Marcus walked into the yard, the neighbor across the street watering her evening plants saw him. She would never forget that moment, Marcus walking slowly, empty-handed, not even carrying the canvas bag he usually used for his sheet music. She smiled and waved. He nodded lightly in return. Nothing in that moment hinted at danger. He turned into the narrow alley that locals called the shortcut to State Street, and a few steps later his silhouette melted into the defective yellow streetlight and disappeared behind the old wooden fences. That was the last image anyone ever had of Marcus Hill. At first, time passed normally. No one in the house thought the worst. Marcus was punctual, rarely stayed out long without checking in, but he also wasn't the type to cause trouble that required constant watching. So when full darkness fell and he still wasn't home, his grandmother simply figured he'd been held up longer than planned. But the night grew thicker, the clock crawled forward, and with every passing minute the unease grew heavier. The family called a few of his close friends, hoping he'd just stopped somewhere and forgotten to call. Every answer was the same: nobody had seen him that night. His grandmother kept glancing at the front door, hoping he'd slipped back quietly, but the lock was exactly as it had been when he left. There was no note on the table, no sign in his room that he'd returned. Neighbors questioned quickly, heard no strange noises, saw no car stop, heard no conversation in the alley. The silence was no longer normal. It felt like a thick curtain hiding something incomprehensible. When the family realized that Marcus, who always let someone know if plans changed, had vanished without explanation, unease turned into real fear. And so, in a house whose walls had witnessed decades of peaceful summers, the phone was picked up. They reported to police that Marcus Hill was missing, a call they never imagined they'd have to make that night. When the missing person call was logged, the first patrol cars arrived on State Street within minutes, their red and blue lights slicing across the old brick walls of the neighborhood, like tense streaks of light tearing through an already heavy night. East St. Louis was a place where police handled big and small troubles daily, but a teenager disappearing in total silence was something they took seriously from the start, especially on a summer night, when everyone knew the city had more dark corners than streetlights could reach. The first officer on scene stepped into the grandmother's yard, asked for basic information, and tried to keep his voice calm so as not to panic the family further. He asked what Marcus was wearing, whether he was carrying anything, who had called him, and which direction he headed. The grandmother recounted everything, struggling to recall every tiny detail, even though the moment had felt too ordinary to stick in memory. Just Marcus walking out the door, nodding to the neighbor, crossing the yard, then turning into the familiar alley. When she mentioned, "He said he'd be right back," the officer simply nodded without comment, and radioed for additional units. The first thing police did was sweep the alley Marcus had entered, a narrow passage of cracked concrete mixed with dust, flanked by leaning weathered fences. Light from the main road only reached far enough to create dim patches. Everything else was long shadows between boards and trash cans pushed against walls. The search was quick because the space was tight and unobstructed, but what they found was nothing. No clear footprints in the dust, no dropped items, no sign Marcus had encountered trouble there. It was as if he stepped into the alley and evaporated the moment he reached the main road. Another team began knocking on nearby doors, interviewing anyone who might have heard or seen something. Most residents said they noticed nothing unusual. A few heard the train, some were watching TV, an elderly couple said they went to bed early. Only one woman said she heard footsteps faster than normal outside her window, but wasn't sure it was Marcus, or just someone passing. Another man said he caught a dark figure flash across the corner, but couldn't identify anyone, because the light was too weak. All the accounts were vague, none solid enough to build a reliable timeline. Still, police wrote down every word, because in a disappearance, sometimes the smallest detail becomes the only lifeline. About an hour after the search began, police expanded the perimeter. They split into 3 directions, one along State Street in case Marcus turned right toward the shops, one through the small park near the tracks where lights were sparse and hiding spots plentiful, and one into the residential area west, though that wasn't a route Marcus usually took. Their footsteps echoed steadily on the hot pavement, radio static mixing with night insects, creating an atmosphere of alert tension, everyone hoping to find something, anything. But along those routes, once again, they found no direct trace of Marcus. No one saw which way he turned. No one saw him get into a car. No one heard an argument or loud impact. The teenager was like a shadow that slid across the asphalt and dissolved into the darkness between streetlights. Follow-up interviews with people near the major intersection yielded nothing better. A young woman said she sat on her porch over 30 minutes and saw no one pass. A group of teens playing basketball at the nearby court said they left when it got dark and didn't see anyone matching Marcus's description. A taxi driver said he drove by, but the street was completely empty, like always. Police tried to reconstruct Marcus's final steps from those scraps, but the sketch contained only one certainty: Marcus had left the house. After that, every path led into emptiness. As the night edged toward dawn, the initial search paused without a single concrete discovery. No screams, no dropped belongings, no identified strange vehicle, no witness who saw a face clearly, no indication Marcus had an accident or left voluntarily. All that remained was the cold fact: a teenager walked out of a peaceful home and disappeared without a trace. And police knew they were now dealing with a disappearance far more difficult than most they'd seen in the area. The morning after Marcus was reported missing, the first sunlight hit State Street, as if exposing everything the silence had hidden. Police returned with more officers, determined to comb areas they hadn't fully covered overnight. When the sun was high enough to illuminate cracks and gutters in the old sidewalks, they widened the search in a fan pattern from the alley Marcus entered to surrounding streets. It was during this sweep that the first piece of evidence unexpectedly appeared, and it immediately made the entire case even more baffling. A young officer checking a vacant lot near Jefferson Avenue, an area that wasn't on any logical route from the grandmother's house, spotted a small object lying against a rusted iron fence. It was the brown leather bracelet Marcus always wore, a gift from his late father. The family confirmed it instantly. Marcus almost never left home without that bracelet. Its presence there not only shocked police but forced them to rethink every assumption about Marcus's final path. because the distance from the last seen alley to this lot was considerable, and more importantly, it was not a route Marcus had any reason to take, day or night. It was a seldom visited spot, used only by kids playing in the afternoon or teens hanging out briefly before leaving. Marcus had no friends or acquaintances nearby, and the family insisted he had never gone that way at night. This forced police to confront the first truly frightening question: if Marcus didn't walk here himself, why was his bracelet here, and how did it end up in a place where no one within the surrounding radius remembered seeing him? A quick survey of the area was conducted. The lot had dry dirt scattered with plastic bottles and old cardboard, mostly trash the wind had collected over time. No fresh, clear footprints, only faint marks impossible to attribute. The iron fence behind the lot was corroded, some bars bent as if someone had climbed over or dragged something against them, but the marks weren't distinct enough to draw conclusions. Another detail that caught attention was the bracelet's position, not in the middle of the lot but right against the fence, as if thrown or pulled off during a struggle. Yet there was no major disturbance around it, no scattered belongings, no broken branches, no drag marks indicating a fight. The calmness of the scene made the bracelet even stranger, as if it had appeared there silently, leaving no story to follow. Police, who had hoped the first piece of evidence would point the investigation somewhere, now faced the reality that the bracelet opened a new direction, one no one expected. A veteran officer, after examining closely, noted the location was outside the original search radius, close to one of the roads leading to a small industrial area south. That zone had little nighttime traffic and wasn't somewhere police thought Marcus had reason to go. The bracelet's presence meant either Marcus went with someone or he was taken there. Both possibilities were alarming. By noon, the area was temporarily sealed, so a more professional search team could continue. They marked every questionable spot with stakes, re-swept the ground for additional small items, looked for shoe prints, drag marks, anything to reconstruct Marcus's movements. But the lot was so old and undisturbed for so long that any traces, if they ever existed, had been erased by time. In the end, the report recorded nothing beyond the bracelet. Still, that single small item was enough to alter the case's trajectory. Marcus's family, when told, could hardly believe the bracelet turned up there. His grandmother said he cherished it and never removed it except to shower. Even if he got into trouble, the bracelet leaving his wrist would be unusual. Police didn't say it aloud, but everyone understood the deeper meaning. The bracelet's presence in that location was the first evidence the disappearance might not be as simple as Marcus wandering off or running away. It suggested intervention, and possibly forceful intervention, by someone else. As afternoon fell and the search team began packing equipment, everyone realized the hunt was no longer just for a lost teenager. It had become a search for traces of an act, an invisible force that pulled Marcus off his safe familiar path and left his bracelet behind in a place he had no reason to ever set foot. And from that small piece of evidence, a new investigative direction officially opened, even though no one yet knew where it would lead them. When Marcus's bracelet was found on the vacant lot near Jefferson Avenue, police realized the search perimeter had to expand far beyond any initial assumptions. They established a new radius, centered on the evidence discovery point, stretching south and east toward the old rail line that ran parallel to the industrial zone abandoned since the late 1980s. This was a stretch of land few people visited, an empty space where crumbling houses and empty warehouses created a feeling of being forgotten even in daylight. The next morning, under sunlight that was already turning harsh, search teams fanned out in small groups, combing every square foot in silence. The vacant lot where the bracelet was recovered was only the starting point. From there they followed faint paths into areas no one had previously considered. Knee-high weeds were pushed aside as officers advanced, the swish of grass mixing with the crunch of boots on dry ground to create a heavy sound, as if every step were stirring up long-buried stories. From the lot, the trail led to the nearby rail spur, an unused line that still held rotting ties, rusted rails, and scattered ballast stone. What caught police attention first wasn't a clear mark, but the mismatch between the scene and the setting. Along the ballast, There were small patches of stone that looked recently disturbed, yet not enough to suggest someone had intentionally moved or struggled there. The lightly compressed spots were irregular in shape, but because of strong wind the night before, no one could say whether they were footprints or just natural shifting of gravel. The strange part was that these disturbed areas appeared in scattered clusters, neither forming a clear path nor completely random. One officer crouched to examine them and said he'd seen similar patterns before, but in accidents there were usually dropped items or broken pieces. Here, there was nothing at all. Near the end of the spur, the team noticed a short drag mark in the dirt, only a few feet long, then it stopped abruptly with no continuation on either side. This created a paradox. If someone was dragged, the force would normally continue for a significant distance. If a heavy object was moved, the track would be longer. But here the mark appeared and ended suddenly, as if someone started an action and stopped instantly, or as if the rest had been skillfully erased. Police noted it but couldn't form a fitting theory. From the tracks they moved into the cluster of abandoned warehouses just minutes away on foot. The buildings had once belonged to a local trucking company that went bankrupt. Now only rusted steel frames, perforated tin roofs, and rotting wooden panels remained. When the team stepped inside, clouds of dust rose from the cracked concrete floors, making them pause for a few seconds. This wasn't a place kids played or teens hung out. It was too desolate and gloomy for anyone to risk entering, especially at night. That alone made the possible presence of Marcus here incomprehensible. They checked every warehouse, every dark corner, every old wooden crate. Sometimes they thought they'd found footprints, but under flashlight, the dents turned out to be years-old impressions from heavy objects long removed. Sometimes a metal bar looked freshly bent, but closer inspection showed rust had formed over the bend long ago. Everything gave the feeling of almost having a clue, yet never enough to confirm anything. What began to unsettle the investigators wasn't the absence of traces, but the selective absence, as if something had happened here and the signs had been covered in a way that made everything look natural. Another officer pointed out that one warehouse door was slightly ajar, yet the dust at the contact point was undisturbed. That meant it could have been opened for years, or opened recently by someone extremely careful not to leave marks. A series of notes were added to the scene map, but no observation was strong enough to become evidence. As afternoon fell, police decided to push the search one more ring outward toward the old industrial lots. Along the access paths they found unevenly compressed patches of dirt. Normally trucks or machinery could cause such compression, but this industrial zone had been shut down for years. No one used it for parking, and there were no fresh tire tracks. The compressed spots didn't form clear tracks, just scattered marks as if from feet or light objects repeatedly set down and lifted. Once again, unnatural interruptions appeared, streaks of darker soil that looked moistened by something, but testing showed neither water nor oil. It was as if someone had started to obscure traces and then stopped halfway. The inconsistencies in the crime scene gradually became clear. Everywhere they looked there were signs of movement, but never enough to prove a person or vehicle had been present. The interruptions, the scattered compressions, the suspicious points that didn't match the surroundings, all created the feeling that something had taken place here, but no one knew how, when or what it had to do with Marcus. By the end of the day, the search teams returned with more questions than answers. They came back to the starting point with maps covered in red circles marking places to recheck. But one thing had become clear: Marcus's disappearance was not simply a teenager leaving home and getting lost. The space around the case was telling a different story, a story that was interrupted, blurred, and far more complicated than anyone thought when Marcus stepped into that dark alley. And it was precisely those inconsistencies that made everyone feel they weren't just looking for traces of a boy, but for traces of a deliberate act carried out by someone who wanted to block the search for the truth. When the examination of the vacant lot, the rail spur, and the abandoned warehouses yielded no clear traces beyond the scene's inconsistencies, police shifted focus to gathering statements from residents around every area Marcus might have passed. They hoped that if the physical scene wouldn't speak, the people, with their habit of unconsciously observing every night, might have accidentally seen things police couldn't. But instead of solid leads, they collected three completely contradictory statements, three disconnected pictures describing three different locations claimed to be where Marcus was last seen. The contradictions didn't just create noise, they cast doubt on the reliability of all three witnesses, and most importantly, showed that something in the story was being distorted, intentionally or not. The first witness was a middle-aged woman who lived near the alley Marcus used. She was certain she saw a figure resembling Marcus standing at the corner of State Street near the old store's vending machine. She said he stood there a few seconds, as if waiting for someone, then turned and walked away. When police asked if she saw which direction he went, she shook her head. She had gone back inside right after. The location she described was the direction Marcus usually took when heading to the corner store or meeting friends across the neighborhood, a relatively logical route. This statement initially made police think Marcus might have voluntarily changed direction and never went toward Jefferson where the bracelet was found. The second witness offered a completely different scenario. He was a man who lived beside the rail area and often walked there in the evenings to cool off after work. He said that on the night Marcus vanished, he saw a teenager in a light-colored shirt running across the rail zone, looking rushed as if someone were chasing him. He didn't see anyone behind the boy, but the hurried running itself stuck in his mind once he heard Marcus was missing. When asked to describe the build more clearly, he could only say looked like a kid about Marcus's age. That made the statement hard to confirm. But if true, it directly contradicted the woman on State Street, because the two locations were far apart, and Marcus couldn't have been in both places almost simultaneously. The third witness pushed the case in yet another direction. He was a young man working the late shift at a riverfront restaurant. He said he saw a boy walking near the riverside parking lot, head slightly down, hands in pockets, looking around, as if searching for someone. When shown Marcus's photo, he said it very possibly was him. What made this statement suspicious was that the described location was far from both the rail spur and State Street, and not on any reasonable route from his grandmother's house. Still, the young man sounded certain enough that police couldn't dismiss it. When the three statements were laid side by side, they were almost impossible to fit into a logical timeline. One Marcus waiting on State Street, one Marcus running in panic near the tracks, one Marcus walking near the riverside parking lot, looking for a meetup. All three differed in behavior, location, and mental state. This put investigators in a bind. They couldn't discard any statement without concrete proof it was wrong, yet they also couldn't stitch them into a coherent sequence. Upon closer review, a theory began to form, the possibility that at least one of the statements had been distorted. Maybe by hazy memory, maybe by poor lighting causing mistaken identity, or worse, someone deliberately feeding false information to mislead. Suspicion grew when they realized the second and third statements came from people who didn't personally know Marcus, while the first came from someone who had watched him for years. That made police consider that perhaps only one was accurate, or all three were wrong to some degree. But the crucial truth remained unchanged. Police still could not pinpoint Marcus's final confirmed location. Each statement, if true, opened an entirely separate search direction, and if false, pulled them farther from an already elusive truth. When the three locations were plotted on a map, investigators noticed something disturbing. The points formed a triangle that covered almost the entire southern zone, where the city transitioned from residential to industrial and riverfront, a wide, dark area perfect for concealing unusual activity. That geometric coincidence made them understand the case wasn't moving closer to resolution, it was expanding like a tangled web, forcing them to split resources in three completely different directions. At the end of that day, when all reports were stacked on the table, the lead investigator could only sigh. Not because of a lack of information, but because there was too much that didn't match. Those contradictory statements didn't just challenge the ability to reconstruct Marcus's final steps, they made one thing clear: someone or something had interfered with the story the moment Marcus disappeared, and that interference was keeping police spinning in a maze with no exit. After the three contradictory statements made Marcus's last movements impossible to pin down, the investigative team had to take a step back and look at the whole picture. With no clear physical traces, no sharp security footage, and no fully reliable witness, they were forced to build 6 foundational theories to guide the days ahead. These 6 weren't just logical possibilities, they were a reflection of the very chaos the disappearance was creating, a chaos that left every path murky and unsupported. The first theory was that Marcus was lured away. This was the direction police examined most closely. When recalling the family's detail, Marcus left immediately after a mysterious phone call. He didn't say who called, didn't explain where he was going, just said he'd be back soon. For a 17-year-old living in a familiar neighborhood, walking out at night because of one call showed he trusted the person on the other end, or at least saw no danger. If the caller was someone he knew, or someone in a position that made Marcus feel safe, he could leave without hesitation. However, no family member or friend reported making or receiving a similar call that night. No one said they had plans to meet Marcus, and there was no evidence he had arranged anything. This left the lured theory, resting mostly on intuition and the single detail of the call. Yet it remained the strongest, because it logically explained his calm departure. The second theory was stranger abduction. It was the scenario police hated to consider early, but initial elements made it impossible to ignore. The bracelet found in an illogical place, interrupted drag marks along the tracks, suspicious spots in the abandoned warehouses. A teenager snatched by a stranger within minutes of leaving home wasn't unheard of in East St. Louis, though rare. The city had seen quick, clean street attacks that left little trace. The problem: if Marcus was abducted, why did no one hear screams or a struggle, and how could the perpetrator remove him from the area so fast without being seen? This theory explained the sudden vanishing, but clashed with the lack of clear, forcible evidence at the search sites. The third theory was an undetected accident. The city had plenty of dark zones, unfinished construction, disused rail spurs, deep stormwater ditches, and crumbling warehouse roofs that could collapse any time. If Marcus accidentally fell into a hidden spot or slipped, he could be badly injured and unheard. This theory also explained the absence of third-party involvement and was kept open in the early hours. The issue was that the most dangerous areas had already been thoroughly searched with no fresh signs. That lowered the accident likelihood, but didn't eliminate it, since wider zones still needed checking. The fourth theory, rarely discussed but still required, was that Marcus left after an argument. He might have fought with family or friends and stormed off to avoid conflict. But the family insisted there was no conflict that day. Marcus showed no signs of sadness or pressure. He said he'd be right back in a completely normal tone. If he intended to run away, he would have taken personal items or money. He took nothing. Still, one witness mentioning someone running near the tracks kept this as a secondary possibility. But if Marcus ran away, why was the bracelet in an unrelated spot? And why were there no footprints leading to it? Those points made the argument then leave theory weak. The fifth theory was involvement in local criminal activity. In the late 1980s and early 90s, parts of East St. Louis were used as drop or exchange points for illegal goods. Marcus wasn't involved in any of that, but it didn't rule out him accidentally witnessing something or being pulled into an unwanted situation. The abandoned warehouses and old industrial lots had past reports of suspicious activity, though police never found hard proof. If Marcus was taken there or drawn in without understanding, it would explain the interrupted traces. But this direction opened an investigation scope too broad, requiring massive time and resources. The final and least likely theory was voluntary departure. This was the standard route in teen disappearances, but this case had almost no matching signs. Marcus took nothing, prepared nothing, had no family conflict, left no note, and had no reason to vanish silently forever. Moreover, his bracelet appeared in a place that made no sense for someone leaving on his own. Still, investigative protocol required keeping this theory on the list until fully disproven. When the 6 theories were laid out, each pulled the search in a different direction, each demanding significant resources and time. But the most dangerous part was that the 6 theories did not intersect at any clear common point. They only branched, expanded, and created the feeling that this disappearance followed no pattern police had ever seen. A teenager leaves home, a bracelet in the wrong place, interrupted traces, 3 contradictory sightings. Everything stood beside one another like puzzle pieces that refused to connect. By the end of the day, when reports were piled in the temporary command room, the team realized they were facing a case where every theory seemed right in one spot but wrong in many others. No single theory was strong enough to steer the entire investigation, and none was weak enough to discard. That feeling, not a shortage of information, but an excess of mismatched information, made them understand that the coming days would not just be about finding Marcus, but about finding a truth someone or something was deliberately keeping hidden behind the abandoned buildings and dark streets of East St. Louis. After the 6 initial theories were established, without any single one strong enough to lead the main investigation, East St. Louis police were forced to classify Marcus Hill's disappearance as a missing endangered juvenile, a designation reserved for cases where a minor is at high risk of physical or mental harm. Raising the priority level was not just administrative procedure, it marked a shift in how authorities viewed the case. This was no longer a routine missing person report, but one that could escalate into tragedy if not handled quickly. Marcus's file was escalated to higher command, the missing children unit was mobilized, and patrol divisions were ordered to assist with round-the-clock expanded searches. Areas previously covered by small teams were now divided into major grids, each with additional manpower, canine units, and portable lighting for nighttime operations. Topographic maps, aerial photos, and city land use records were pulled and marked for every spot that could conceal evidence, or every poorly lit back alley in residential zones. But despite the increased manpower and wider search radius, the case slipped into a strange state. The more they searched, the larger the void became. One morning, 50 officers and volunteers formed a shoulder-to-shoulder line sweeping the City Edge Park, filled with thick brush and low mounds. They moved step by step, bending to examine every branch and crevice for anything tied to Marcus. They found only gravel, dead leaves, and the marks of time. Canine C were deployed repeatedly, yet picked up no clear scent trail. This worried the handlers. If Marcus had passed through those areas, the dogs could usually detect something, even if wind had diluted it. Here, there was zero reaction. That either meant Marcus had never been there, or the scent had been erased in an unusual way. Both possibilities were alarming. Another team pushed the search down to the riverfront zone, where dirt roads led to temporary parking areas and rarely used footpaths. Past disappearances had been linked to this stretch, not because of crime, but because of the tricky terrain and weak lighting. Yet even after meticulously checking the riverbank, gentle slopes, and tall grass turned up no sign Marcus had ever been there. The fact that a 17-year-old could vanish from a busy residential neighborhood without leaving a trace created an unease that was hard to put into words. In the following days, police conducted dozens more interviews: night shift workers, evening joggers, taxi drivers, newspaper deliverers, even transients squatting in the abandoned warehouses. Every answer was a dead end. Some mentioned seeing a shadow or a figure that night, but the descriptions were too vague to use. Those hazy statements only reinforced that investigators were walking through thick fog, never enough light to see the path, yet no place to stop. In the temporary command post, files piled higher. Maps were covered in overlapping red and blue marker lines, new routes drawn over old ones. Some zones were searched 3 times and still yielded nothing. The vacant lot, where the bracelet was found, was re-examined with thermal imaging and infrared cameras, results completely blank. No recent movement, no drag marks, no fresh burial signs. Police began to realize they were facing the most dangerous kind of case, one with no anchor point. If there had been tire tracks, footprints, dropped belongings, they could follow them. But Marcus's case had nothing solid to grasp. Every scrap of information was either too vague, too random, or contradicted other scraps. The result was that every new investigative avenue hit an invisible wall. Worse, the critical first days, the golden window in missing person cases, were slipping away too fast. On the third night after Marcus vanished, a veteran officer quietly told his partner he couldn't remember the last disappearance with zero clear physical clues. No tire marks, no scrap of clothing, no wallet, no lost shoe, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Marcus stepped into the space between two streets, and the entire city had swallowed every trace of him. Younger officers felt the pressure differently. They felt like they were running inside a dark box, searching for an exit that was only walls. Some began privately wondering whether the inconsistent ground compressions and abruptly ending drag marks were signs of a deliberate cleanup, but without concrete proof, they couldn't put that theory in official reports. When the fourth-day report was submitted to command, one line was written bluntly: "Current status shows signs of stagnation, lack of directional evidence, theories unable to be narrowed." No one wanted to read that, and it was exactly what pushed Marcus's case deeper into dangerous territory. When a disappearance stalls this early, the chance of finding the person alive drops by the hour. For Marcus Hill, the truly frightening part was this: they had no evidence he had left the area on his own 2 feet, or in someone else's hands. The case was now top priority, but priority cannot replace clues. And in the thick silence enveloping East St. Louis, all they had was a vanished teenager and a city that seemed to have swallowed every sign of him. As the Marcus Hill investigation began to stall despite being elevated to missing endangered juvenile, a new element unexpectedly emerged, not from the scene or physical evidence, but from repeated interviews with residents near the disappearance zone. A pattern slowly surfaced. Multiple people mentioned the presence of an old sedan around the time Marcus vanished. Strangely, this detail hadn't been reported in the first days, partly because no one thought it relevant. Old cars were common, and the area around State Street always had traffic. But when police returned to every household for follow-ups, that sedan kept reappearing, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to surface, like a ghost at the edge of the story. The first witness described it as a late 1970s sedan, light silver or ash gray, with light scratches along the side. She said it was parked near a utility pole, a few houses down from hers, on the exact evening Marcus left. She hadn't paid much attention, but she remembered it didn't belong to anyone on the block. The second witness insisted the car was dark green, long body style, and he remembered it clearly because it flashed its headlights for a few seconds, then turned them off, as if the driver were watching something. That made him notice, but since nothing happened afterward, he forgot until police asked again. The third witness, living near the intersection leading to the rail spur, said the car was reddish-brown, and he saw it crawling past his house right as he was locking up for the night. He clearly recalled the headlights sweeping the pavement, but couldn't recall the plate. When the 3 descriptions were placed side by side, investigators immediately saw a massive problem. Not only were the locations different, the colors were completely contradictory. Was it one sedan or 3 separate cars, or were memories warped by poor lighting and time? Every possibility was on the table. Yet what police couldn't ignore was this: it was rare for multiple unrelated people to mention an unfamiliar old sedan in the same narrow time window and general area, unless it had actually stood out somehow. A veteran officer made a key observation: conflicting color reports didn't necessarily rule out a single vehicle. The flickering yellowish streetlights in the disappearance zone could make silver look gray, green look black, or brown look brick red. Neon signs or headlight glare could distort paint entirely. So the color contradictions didn't kill the lead. They reinforced that one car had likely been seen multiple times in a short period. That was critical, because it suggested the sedan wasn't just passing through, it may have been moving through the neighborhood with purpose. What made it more complicated was the timing: roughly 30 minutes before Marcus vanished, right when he left the house, and once more shortly after he was believed to be gone. That tight window raised questions. Was the car looking for someone, tailoring Marcus's route, or was it pure coincidence creating noise? When asked about the license plate, answers only muddied things further. No one could read it, understandable in the dim light. One thought it was an Illinois plate with blue lettering, another swore it had the red border typical of Missouri plates, A third was certain the plate was obscured by dust or mud. Nothing solid enough to narrow the search. Still, several witnesses noted the car moved unusually slowly, as if the driver were scanning houses rather than looking for an address. One even said, "I had the feeling that car was waiting for somebody." Though subjective, it fit perfectly with Marcus leaving after a mysterious call. Putting the call and the sedan together, investigators finally had a focused theory instead of 6 sprawling ones. Marcus may not have walked away alone, but the questions remained. What exact car was it? Who owned it? Why was it circling the neighborhood that night? When the team plotted the sightings on a map, they saw the sedan had moved in an arc that ringed the residential area, as if canvassing or blocking possible exits. That tilted them toward believing the car was directly tied to Marcus's disappearance. If true, it could be the first pivotal break. But another chilling possibility also emerged. If the sedan was involved in an abduction, it could have taken Marcus miles away in minutes, explaining the total lack of traces in the search zones. Without a plate though, they couldn't pull traffic cam or toll data. The case faced yet another fork. The sedan opened a promising new direction, but also dozens of potential dead ends. In marathon sessions, police called every local garage asking about older sedans recently serviced. Some shops had worked on similar cars, but none could place an owner there the exact night Marcus vanished. Stolen vehicle reports didn't match. The car could have come from out of town, been unregistered, or worst case disposable, used for the crime and then destroyed. Police were back in the familiar loop. A lead existed, but it was too broad to grab. This time though, one fact wouldn't let them drop it. Despite contradictions, multiple people remembered that sedan. That couldn't be coincidence. On the 5th day, the lead investigator drew a large red circle on the map enclosing every area the car might have traveled. He said one sentence that silenced the room. "If we find that car, we find Marcus." No one knew if it was true, but it was enough to pivot the entire investigation from that moment on. And so the old sedan appearing as a blurry ghost, no one agreeing on its color, no one catching its plate, became the first real turning point in the case. A new investigative path was officially opened, even if the road ahead was still dark, unlit, and full of unseen forks. As the team began zeroing in on the old sedan as the most promising lead yet, a young officer suddenly remembered something others had overlooked. The corner grocery on State Street had installed a security camera in the late 1980s, an old VHS system that recorded low-quality black and white footage. The store had changed owners several times, and the camera had been inactive for years, but it might still be mounted under the awning, and could have captured scattered frames at night if power hadn't been fully cut. Though the odds were slim, the team decided to check. When they arrived, the dusty rectangular unit was indeed still bolted under the eave. Wires were frayed, the control box rusted, but the new owner confirmed the system had never been fully removed. Tech specialists were called in. It took almost 2 hours to extract the single remaining tape. Most of it degraded, but several segments still held fragmented images. Holding their breath, they played it back. Grainy, jumping black and white footage filled the screen, vertical noise lines dancing like silver threads. They fast-forwarded to the window when Marcus was believed to have left home. And then, just when they thought the tape was useless, a familiar shape appeared, an old sedan slowly rolling past the front of the store. It entered from the left of frame, moving slower than normal traffic, gliding as if scanning the street. The image was too blurry for detail, but the body style matched at least one witness description: late 70s or early 80s, long body, roof trim catching a glint. They slowed the tape. Minutes later the same car reappeared, now traveling the opposite direction. It made a turn near the store and disappeared off-frame toward the rail spur, exactly matching statements that the sedan was seen in that zone, the night Marcus vanished. The room went quiet. No one needed to say it. For the first time they had actual footage, not a story, not a vague feeling of the suspect's sedan. The excitement lasted only seconds. The license plate was completely illegible. Vertical noise obliterated the bottom of the frame, exactly where the plate sat. Not a single character readable. Worse, the tape quality was so poor, they couldn't make out the driver. only a dark silhouette behind the windshield. Still, three details made the tape invaluable. 1. The timing aligned almost perfectly with Marcus leaving his grandmother's house. 2. The car appeared twice in a very short window, proof it wasn't a one-time pass. 3. Its second pass took it deeper into the zone, where Marcus's bracelet was later found. Those 3 points alone made the tape the strongest lead since the case began, even if it couldn't identify the owner. What chilled them more was how perfectly timed the sedan's movements were. It passed the last place Marcus was seen, turned just as he vanished, then headed toward the interrupted evidence trail. Some officers began asking aloud, was this car stalking someone that night? Did the driver know Marcus was about to walk out, or was it coincidence? Technical analysis was clear. No enhancement could recover the plate or the driver's face. The car could only be guessed as late I-70s/early I-80s American sedan. The tape became half evidence, strong enough to redirect the entire investigation, yet too vague to name a suspect. That evening, as the team met again, one officer tapped his pen on the table, staring at the blurry still printed from the screen, and said, "We have the car, but we still don't know who the car belongs to." That sentence summed up everything. The footage confirmed the mystery sedan existed. It placed the car and Marcus in the same area at the same time. It showed purposeful movement through the streets that night, but it gave police the one thing they needed most, the identity of the person behind the wheel. With no plate, no clear angle, and no working traffic cameras in 1990, the sedan lead, for all its promise, still opened onto a vast space of uncertainty. Finally, the lead investigator spoke quietly. "The data isn't enough to ID a suspect, but that car, it knows something. Whoever was driving it knows something." And so the blurry sedan from the old VHS tape became the new center of the case. Not just an object moving through the night, Marcus disappeared, but the shadow of an unseen force, still evading every light, leaving only the gaps police had yet to fill. When the footage from the old camera yielded no real breakthrough, the Marcus Hill case gradually slid into a trajectory no investigator wanted: prolonged silence. In the first 3 months after Marcus disappeared, police stubbornly pursued every lead, from scattered reports about the sedan, calls claiming someone resembling Marcus in other neighborhoods, to anonymous tips suggesting he might have left the state, but all led to dead ends. No new evidence, no reliable clues, and time began eroding the memories of those who had seen something that night he vanished. As the city entered 1991, Marcus's case was officially downgraded to an open file, meaning it still existed, still archived, but without a full-time investigative team attached. A few detectives were assigned periodic follow-up, but they also had to handle dozens of ongoing cases in the city. Just like that, Marcus's file wasn't completely abandoned, but it was no longer prioritized as before. This was the phase where fragmentation began. The case file, at first contained in a few folders, gradually split into multiple directions. The initial team focused on evidence search, another pursued the sedan lead, another checked the theory that Marcus left with an acquaintance. Each added notes, maps, interview reports, but they were stored in different departments. The result, over a few years, the case file no longer resided in one place, but was scattered between evidence rooms, criminal records offices, the county police department, and even auxiliary storage at the police department. In the pre-digital era, this dispersion was a silent death sentence for many missing persons cases: more paperwork, more storage locations, harder for anyone to grasp the full picture. A new investigator taking the case in 1993 wrote, "I spent 3 days just finding all the parts of the file. What I read wasn't enough to build a timeline. The file was fragmented to the point it was hard to believe this was once a high-priority case." But it wasn't just the file that fragmented, the evidence suffered the same fate. Marcus's bracelet was stored in a small box in the evidence room, but at one point, it was moved to auxiliary storage because new cases needed space. Maps marking the sedan's movements were stashed in a drawer unknown to newcomers. A bag of trash collected from the abandoned warehouse area, logged as unrelated, ended up mixed into a car theft file, making it disappear from Marcus's evidence list for years. No critically important item was permanently lost, but the temporary misplacement of each small piece made reconstructing the big picture exponentially harder. Worse, time eroded what every missing persons case relies on: witnesses. East St. Louis in the 90s wasn't stable. People moved frequently, partly for jobs, partly for unsafe living conditions. Many witnesses in Marcus's case, those who saw the sedan, the figure running near the tracks, or Marcus on State Street, had relocated within a year or two. When police tried to follow up for clarifications on initial contradictions, they found one moved to Missouri, another to California, one left no forwarding address, one died of illness, and one simply didn't want to talk anymore. "I don't remember clearly, don't ask me," he said in the last call. Without witnesses, new evidence or file progress, the case drifted further from the light. The original team was gradually replaced by new detectives, each with a different understanding of the case. Newcomers relied on old reports, but those reports were incomplete because file parts were split. Veterans remembered some details, but not the sequence, or didn't have the related files. From 1991 to 1999, Marcus's case was opened and closed multiple times as re-evaluations, but none produced a breakthrough. A 1994 team concluded the voluntary departure theory might be higher than thought, but lacked proof. Another in 1996 suggested the sedan might be unrelated, just a stranger's car passing by. These conflicting views continued fragmenting the approach, locking everything into an endless loop: open for review, insufficient dated, close wait for next evaluation. During this time, Marcus's family persisted. They called police every few months for updates, but the answer was always the same: no progress. His grandmother aged faster than anyone expected, her hair turning white in just a few years after losing the boy. Every time she looked into Marcus's bedroom, she told investigators she believed he was still out there somewhere. But belief couldn't replace evidence or witnesses, and police could only continue logging her words in the file. By the late 90s, Marcus's case officially became a cold case, not because it was deliberately forgotten, but because every path led to a wall. Scattered notes, blurry footage, the bracelet found in an illogical spot, conflicting statements, the mysterious sedan creeping through the night of disappearance, all stood beside each other like ghosts refusing to form one story. And as years passed, nothing new emerged to clarify. For nearly a decade, Marcus Hill's case remained like that, suspended between theories, sinking into drawer number 14 of the cold case room, where unsolved cases lay dormant, waiting for something, someone, some opportunity, to be revived. But at that moment, in late 1999, no one knew it would take many more years, more than a generation, for the truth to begin dripping back into the light. In early 2001, nearly 2 decades after Marcus vanished, the case was too cold to appear in East St. Louis Police Department wrap-up meetings. But then an event 60 miles away, on the Missouri side, suddenly pulled the case back to the surface, not as a direct lead, but as an echo of something familiar enough to catch investigators' attention. One late February morning, fishermen in the Merrimack River forest area discovered a male body wedged between 2 fallen trees, washed up on shore. The body had been in the water for days, showing decomposition, but was still identifiable as male and roughly late teens to early 20s. Missouri State Police opened an investigation and sent notifications to neighboring states, including Illinois, per protocol for unidentified remains. When photos and descriptions reached East St. Louis, a records room officer, who happened to be reviewing cold cases, immediately noticed: male, teen, possible river area disappearance. Those traits were enough for him to forward the info up the chain, leading to contact with the team that had handled Marcus's case. No one wanted false hope, but after all those years, even a slight connection warranted verification. A small team was sent to Missouri for identification assistance. Examining clothing, height, and body features, they quickly concluded the body wasn't Marcus Hill. Preliminary DNA didn't match samples from Marcus's family, but what stood out wasn't the identity, but the manner of death. Though damaged, Missouri investigators noted signs of bound wrists, injuries on shoulder and back, small but sharp cuts on clothing, and crucially, the body placement in water, not accidental, but seeming like an attempt to hide it. It didn't resemble drowning accident, or self-harm. It bore hallmarks of deliberate criminal action. When this info returned to Illinois, it inevitably reminded investigators of vague but unexplained details in Marcus's file: his bracelet in an illogical location, strange disturbances along the tracks, scattered interrupted compression marks like tampered, the mysterious sedan appearing repeatedly around the time Marcus vanished. All were details insufficient for abduction conclusion, but not fitting ordinary accident. The anonymous body in Missouri amplified that similarity. Young male victim, disappeared from residential area without clear sighting, found in conditions suggesting concealment. Though not Marcus, it revived a suspicion once shelved for lack of proof. Did a criminal pattern targeting teens exist in the area around 1990 that police then missed? To answer, they needed to cross-reference all regional crime data around Marcus's disappearance. A younger investigator, reviewing files, noticed a coincidence from late 80s to early 90s, scattered in southern Illinois and eastern Missouri, several unexplained disappearances or deaths. Not enough for a series, but each with unexplained elements. A teen vanished in Belleville, found only shoes near last sighting by a bridge. Another in Jefferson County disappeared while biking, bike found miles away undamaged. Another in St. Louis suburbs, victim unconfirmable assault, but seen signs of suspicious movement. All had been treated as isolated, unrelated. But from 2001's perspective, with the anonymous body on the Missouri-Illinois border, a modus operandi began emerging. Young victims vanished without trace. Crime areas near tracks, warehouses or river edges. Concealment not sophisticated, but enough to stump contemporary police. In the internal report, after the Missouri trip, one investigator wrote, "Though not Marcus Hill, the criminal pattern is unavoidable. If this is part of repeated behavior, even if not one person, perhaps a common regional act, we need to re-examine Marcus in broader context." Though no new lead for Marcus, the anonymous body acted as a mirror. What police missed in 1990, it showed Marcus's case might not be a lost boy, or simple fight then run as old theories suggested. It hinted Marcus, like the Missouri victim, might have encountered someone or a group capable of harm, but without concrete proof, it stayed suspicion. Back in Illinois, the team had no new findings, but everyone carried a chilling feeling. If that body wasn't Marcus, where had Marcus been all these years? The 2001 anonymous body didn't solve the 1990 disappearance, but it made clear one thing: a dark stretch existed between Illinois and Missouri, where stories like Marcus's could vanish without explanation. And that dark stretch's existence meant Marcus Hill's case, though 11 years old, could no longer be seen as a lone disappearance. After the 2001 anonymous body, Marcus Hill's case sank again, but not into the absolute oblivion of prior years. Some investigators, especially younger ones, raised in the emerging digital era, kept the case on possible re-review when opportunity arises. That opportunity came unexpectedly in 2005, not from the scene, not from new witnesses, but from a dusty cardboard box full of old VHS tapes, donated by an elderly resident moving out, with a note, "If you guys need to revisit the neighborhood's past, I kept a lot." Initially, no one thought those 90s tapes held real value. They were just neighborhood life footage, backyard parties, passing cars, kids playing mementos more than investigative material. But a young detective, who had studied Marcus's case during internship, decided to review each roll, because the blurry 1990 grocery camera image of the mystery sedan still haunted him. And then, as if luck chose this moment, he paused on a tape labeled, "Summer 90, Block BBQ." The footage captured a resident gathering on State Street mid-June that year, weeks before Marcus vanished. The VHS camera mostly aimed at the yard, but occasionally panned to the street as the holder filmed passing cars. And in those seemingly mundane seconds, what made the whole team jump up appeared: a sedan identical to the one in the 1990 grocery camera. Not clear footage, but enough to recognize hallmarks: long hood, rounded vintage roof, bright trim on the hood edge, and unusually slow movement as it glided through frame. But what made the tape special wasn't the car shape, but what appeared in one single frame: a glint from the license plate. As the sedan passed a direct sunlight spot, the plate's surface reflected a small but sharp white streak though characters weren't visible. The reflection showed a light background plate, issued in Illinois 1987, 1993, not Missouri or Kentucky's darker ones. Plus, the plate's shape, long slightly rounded corners, and mounting points indicated civilian registration, not commercial or temporary. These small details were the first breakthrough since the 1990 blurry camera. If the store camera confirmed the sedan's presence, the night Marcus vanished, the 2005 VHS tape revealed its registration nature. That allowed police to do what they couldn't in the 90s, narrow possible vehicles. Knowing the plate likely Illinois 87, 93, they eliminated hundreds of similar cars from Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, and nearby. They also narrowed models based on body and roof style, common in 1977, 1982 sedans. Digitizing and magnifying frames, they spotted an eye-unseen detail, dual parallel tail light streaks, hallmarks of early NE80s, Ford LTD or Mercury Marquis. Not definitive, but shrinking from over 30 vintage sedan models to about 5 main ones. One investigator exclaimed, "First time in 15 years the car isn't a blurry sedan, it has a real shape now." Yet that joy was quickly overshadowed by familiar disappointment. The tape was too old for plate lettering, angle too off for car color, reflection too little for driver visibility. Once again, like 1990, the VHS opened half a door, not enough to enter. But this time importance lay not in what they saw, but what they excluded. Excluded Missouri cars, excluded mismatched tail styles, excluded colors where light wouldn't reflect on plate, excluded dark background plates that couldn't flash on camera. This data went to Illinois Vehicle Registration, and though they couldn't request 15-year-old owner lists, they could get stats by model and area. Results showed within 20 miles of East St. Louis, only a few dozen Ford LTD Mercury Marquis vintage cars were registered in 1990. Though lacking specific owners, it was a major narrowing from over a decade vagueness. An older investigator, who worked Marcus in 1990, but now in another department, watched the VHS and went silent. He said, "We've come full circle. Thought we fell off the map, then back to that exact car." But he reminded the team, "Don't think this is the key. It's just a sharper shadow of a blurry one." And indeed, they still couldn't ID a suspect. Couldn't confirm this VHS sedan was the disappearance night car. Couldn't ID the driver. Couldn't prove direct case link. But they narrowed the pool from countless old sedans to a few matching models, from countless plates to one likely type, from shadow to specific shape. Investigation didn't advance to solution, but enough for a new direction, one that, 20 years later when modern tech revisited, would become key to an unexpected breakthrough. However, in 2005, it remained potential lead. Like every lead over 15 years, it cracked a small door, but not enough light to see what lay behind. But this time at least, the mystery sedan had a clearer shape than ever, and sometimes, just a sharper shadow is enough for a cold case to wait for another revival chance. In 2024, nearly 3 decades after Marcus Hill vanished, and almost 2 decades after the 2005 VHS tape, a new element emerged, not from witnesses or physical evidence, but from the evolution of modern investigative technology. The Illinois State Police established a periodic review program for long cold cases, and Marcus's file, once considered unsolvable, was suddenly prioritized due to pattern similarities with older regional disappearances and the existence of a large volume of raw data never analyzed with contemporary tools. The cold case unit, now made up of seasoned detectives, paired with state digital forensics experts, received the case in a fragmented, tattered and chaotic state that no one could fully grasp just by reading page by page. Dozens of folders from different baskets were brought into the workroom and spread across a long table, old maps, black and white scene photos, handwritten notes, interview reports, faded typewriter printouts, and boxes holding the few remaining pieces of evidence. The very first thing the unit did was digitize everything. The process took weeks, but once finished, it delivered something more valuable than any single physical clue: the ability to reconstruct the full picture, something no one had truly achieved in 3 decades. because the file had been split into too many pieces. After digitization, the files were fed into an AI-assisted analysis system, capable of pattern recognition, semantic comparison of statements, restoration of low-quality images, and minute-by-minute timeline cross-referencing. From that point, a series of new discoveries began emerging like small threads pulling together pieces that had seemed unrelated. First came the 1990 grocery store camera footage. AI-enhanced contrast clarified the sedan's silhouette. Though the plate remained unreadable, the algorithm detected that light reflected off the body in a pattern typical of heavily oxidized metal, characteristic of an older, well-used vehicle. AI also calculated wheel blur to determine speed, showing the sedan was moving deliberately slower than normal traffic, not because of congestion, but because the driver was likely circling and observing. This analysis once again made the sedan the central suspect, this time more strongly than ever. Next was the 2005 VHS tape. AI enhancement revealed the plate's reflection matched the exact angle of Illinois plates issued 1993. More importantly, AI measured the distance ratio between tail light clusters in the VHS and compared it to a vintage car database, determining the contours best matched two models, Ford Ltd Crown Victoria and Mercury Grand Marquis, narrowing the possible vehicles to fewer than a dozen types known to be on the road in the area in 1990. But the most critical breakthrough came from AI cross-referencing old statements. When the system analyzed dozens of pages of notes from 1990, 1991, and 1992, it caught something humans routinely miss: a detail that appeared in one statement but was omitted from two later transcripts of the same witness. The first witness, the woman who saw a figure standing near the vending machine on State Street, initially said she noticed no parked cars. Yet in a separate officer's handwritten note, she mentioned seeing headlights flash on and then off immediately, around the same time. That detail perfectly matched the second witness's account of the sedan, briefly turning on its headlights, as if watching something. This revealed that the first witness likely saw the sedan, but unconsciously omitted it in her formal statement. Old-school investigators never caught the minor discrepancy between the two records, but AI flagged it in red. Another contradiction surfaced in the timeline. The third witness, who claimed to have seen someone resembling Marcus near the Riverside parking lot, described the time as around dusk, but weather records showed the area was already fully dark at the time he indicated. That meant his statement was either mistimed or mislocated, an error no one corrected for decades. As digital experts kept digging, they uncovered another detail hidden in the original 1990 maps. The alley Marcus entered was marked only as leading to State Street. But when AI overlaid the old map with 2024 satellite imagery, it revealed a now demolished narrow service path that once connected to a back road behind the neighborhood, one never canvassed and never searched in 1990 because it was removed in the late 90s and forgotten. If Marcus or the sedan used that path, 1990 investigators would never have known. The most shocking discovery came when AI compared every witness sighting against a real-time map. The three reported locations could not have occurred simultaneously unless two or more different people were seen in the area that night. In other words, some witnesses may have seen someone other than Marcus, possibly the person connected to the sedan. This not only explained decades of contradiction, but raised the possibility that parts of the original timeline never belonged to Marcus at all. When the technical report was finished, the cold case unit realized they were witnessing something no one had seen in 34 years. The original file contained numerous small inconsistencies that, taken together, had thrown the 1990 investigation off course from the start. Those missteps had created 3 decades of deadlock. For the first time in years, the Marcus Hill case was no longer nothing new. It was moving slowly, but surely, toward a horizon with light. But no one knew that what they had just uncovered was only the beginning. The months ahead would bring a breakthrough stronger than any investigator dared hope. While the cold case unit was still re-examining original contradictions and rebuilding the timeline with new tech, the Marcus Hill case received another completely unexpected jolt. this one from an almost unreal coincidence. In early spring 2024, a middle-aged man fishing at dawn on a small Mississippi River town about 40 miles south of East St. Louis accidentally snagged a mud-covered rectangular metal object. At first he thought it was scrap, but when he rinsed the first layer of mud in river water, the faint characters of a license plate appeared. The plate was too rusted to read immediately, but he recognized the rounded corner shape typical of 1980s, 90s Illinois plates. Thinking it might be crime-related, or from a stolen car, he took it to the local sheriff's office. Per protocol, unusual river finds were sent to the state forensics lab for preliminary evaluation. No one expected much. Dozens of plates are lost, dropped or dumped every year. But this is where the eerie coincidence began. When technicians used gentle laser scanning to remove caked mud without damaging the metal, they noticed sediment layers consistent with at least 30 years submerged. The algae and silica pattern on the edges matched samples collected from 1990 Mississippi River events, a distinctive deposit only formed in the late 80s to early 90s. This immediately raised flags. If the plate had been underwater since 1990, it could tie to any incident from that year, including Marcus Hill's disappearance near the river's edge. When the news reached the cold case unit, they requested the plate be sent up for examination. Though cautious, they couldn't ignore the possibility this was the piece they'd hunted for 34 years. In the lab, experts began chemical and reflective light restoration. Layer by layer, rust was lifted, characters slowly emerged. And then, when the plate was clean enough to read the lettering style, the room fell silent for several seconds. It was an Illinois Civilian Series plate issued in 1988, the exact window the 2005 VHS had suggested. Moreover, font style, character spacing, and screw-hole placement all matched plates used on early ID's Ford Ltd Mercury marquee, the very models AI had identified as most likely from the VHS footage. Two clues separated by 15 years, the blurry 1990 store camera and the 2005 VHS, suddenly converged on a single license plate pulled from the Mississippi in 2024. For the first time in decades, the mystery sedan was no longer a shapeless shadow. It had a plate, or at least the plate that once belonged to it. To identify the owner, they needed 1988 Illinois DMV records, long gone from current digital systems. So they went old-school paper archives. Hundreds of thousands of registration sheets sat in state storage boxes by year. Finding the exact plate seemed hopeless. But the unit caught a rare break. Sediment dating narrowed the plate to numbers issued in March or April 1988, shrinking the search from the entire year to a few dozen boxes. After 3 grueling days, they found it, a slightly ink-blurred but legible registration slip. The plate recovered from the Mississippi had been issued to a silver-gray Ford Ltd Crown Victoria, registered at an address in suburban Cahokia, just miles from where Marcus disappeared. The owner in 1990 was a man named Harold Kinney. When that name appeared, the room grew strangely heavy, not because anyone recognized it. On the contrary, no one on the team recalled the name ever surfacing in the original file, and that was the problem. AI had already flagged numerous contradictions in the early investigation. Witnesses in 1990 repeatedly mentioned the sedan, yet no investigator at the time ever put Harold Kinney on a suspect list, despite him owning the exact make and model. Either his registration was never checked, someone looked but didn't document it, or the car simply flew under the radar, an administrative oversight, paperwork mix-up, or plain human error. But the fact that his plate was dumped in the river, and sediment proved it happened shortly after Marcus vanished, made everything far more suspicious. Why was the plate thrown into the Mississippi in 1990? If the car was stolen or lost, why no report? DMV had no record of Harold Kinney ever reporting the plate missing in 1990. If it was legally replaced, there would be a reissue request. None existed. The plate was never reported lost, yet it spent 3 decades on the river bottom. That was not natural, especially when it matched the suspect vehicle perfectly. When the cold case unit laid the restored plate on the table next to AI-analyzed maps, photos and reports, they realized that for the first time since 1990, the scattered pieces of Marcus Hill's case were starting to fit together. The 2001 unidentified body hinted at a regional pattern. The 2005 VHS revealed plate style, and in 2024, the actual plate surfaced from the river as the first physical link to the suspect vehicle. The road ahead was still long, with many unanswered questions, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was time to find Harold Kinney, because someone threw his license plate into the Mississippi the same year Marcus Hill disappeared, and after 34 years, that was no longer just coincidence. Once Harold Kinney's license plate was recovered, and confirmed to have been in the Mississippi since 1990, the theory that his sedan had been sunk became impossible to ignore. The cold case unit knew that if the car was still lay on the riverbed, it might hold traces no one had imagined possible after 34 years, and since the plate was found relatively near the deeper channel south of East St. Louis, they authorized a full sonar sweep of the river stretch for several miles downstream from the recovery site, a technology unavailable in 1990, but routine in 2024. The underwater search team deployed a specialized vessel with side-scan sonar that painted the bottom in characteristic blue. The muddy, powerful Mississippi made operations difficult, but on the second pass a large metallic mass appeared on screen, lying on its side under decades of silt, unmistakably the long silhouette of a sedan body. Mud almost completely buried the roof, exposing only the gentle curve of the passenger cabin and a rear wheel. Technicians marked coordinates. AI analysis of the sonar image confirmed the shape was nearly certain to be an early 1980s Ford Ltd Mercury Marquis, the exact type the VHS had indicated. Not only the model matched, but the location fit perfectly with the presumed route the sedan might have taken that night, leaving the north side neighborhood, heading toward the river, then vanishing from all witness statements. Recovery could not be immediate. Water depth, current, and decades of sediment required heavy cables and a hydraulic barge cranes. As the car began to break the surface, thick black mud clung to every panel and fell away in heavy clumps with a wet thudding sound. The entire team stood silent. They were watching the vehicle they had chased as a ghost for 34 years finally rise from its grave. Once placed on a riverside clearing and hosed down, the lines were clear enough to confirm Ford Ltd Crown Victoria, silver gray, matching Harold Kinney's registration exactly. But what drew investigators' eyes wasn't the make, it was the condition. All doors were locked from the inside, yet the left rear window was shattered, not from impact upon sinking, but broken outward, in a spiderweb pattern, with glass edges bent away from the frame, indicating someone tried to punch out or signal for help. The front frame showed light crumpling, consistent with being pushed or towed, rather than a high-speed crash. The engine bay was packed solid with mud, but the passenger compartment told a different story. Front seats slightly reclined, rear seat torn in a way typical of panic pulling, and a small dent in the rear floorboard, shaped like a shoe print, blurred by decades underwater. A forensics tech noted the damage pattern suggested a struggle inside before submersion. When the car was finally opened with specialized tools, another key detail emerged. The ignition had been forcibly defeated with a tool that pointed to either theft or the owner staging a theft. Most surprising was a folded registration document wedged between the front seat and center console, something normally kept in the glove box. Why was it hidden in a hard-to-reach spot? Had someone been searching or trying to make owner tracing harder? And crucially, why had Harold Kinney never reported the car missing? DMV confirmed no theft report, no re-registration, no damage claim for that Crown Victoria in 1990, or the years after. On paper, his car still legally existed, while in reality, it had been on the river bottom for 3 decades. One young investigator spoke for everyone. If it was stolen, he'd have reported it. If it was repossessed, there'd be paperwork. But the car's in the river, the plates nearby, and Kinney stayed quiet. That's not normal. Inside the trunk they found rotted items too degraded to identify, but one small piece of fabric remained intact enough for analysis, enough to prove the car once carried a person, or something, possibly restrained or compressed. Experts concluded the damage did not match any natural accident scenario. The car hadn't rolled down an embankment, hadn't struck a large object, hadn't sunk in a flood. Every mark bore signs of deliberate human intervention, aimed at sinking the vehicle, while preventing escape from inside. When the full technical report landed on the conference table, every eye turned to one name: Harold Kinney. No one called him the perpetrator yet. There was no direct proof. But Harold Kinney had not told the truth about his car. He never reported it missing, never requested a new plate, never reported damage, and now his sedan had rested on the Mississippi bottom since the exact year Marcus Hill disappeared. All of that was no longer mere suspicion. It had become one heavy, inescapable question: what did Harold Kinney do on the night of 1990? And more importantly, who or what was inside his sedan when it went into the Mississippi? When Harold Kinney's sedan was salvaged, and the autopsy report confirmed the car had been sunk in the river through deliberate action, the cold case unit moved to the next phase, analyzing every remaining piece of evidence inside the vehicle. But after more than 3 decades at the bottom of the Mississippi, most biological traces had been degraded by water, mud, and time to the point they were unusable with older techniques. If this had been 1990, or even 2010, they could have done little more than note that the evidence had lost all value. But 2024 was a time when forensic technology had advanced dramatically, especially next-generation DNA sequencing, massively parallel sequencing, MPS, a tool capable of extracting genetic information, even from extremely degraded samples once considered worthless. In the lab, they sampled the areas least affected by water intrusion: fabric fragments in the trunk, a section of rear seat vinyl still clinging to flakes of human skin, and a tiny patch of fibers stuck under the floor mat. Each sample contained only a few surviving cells, but that was enough for MPS to begin its process. 3 days later, the results appeared on the screen: a 37% complete DNA profile, below the ideal standard, but sufficient to analyze key genetic markers. The first question the team sought to answer after 3 decades was, had Marcus ever been inside this sedan? The result was unequivocal: the DNA did not match Marcus Hill's profile. Though it sounded like a disappointment at first, it was actually hugely significant. It proved the car had been connected to someone else at a time, either before or after it went into the river, someone other than Marcus, but possibly linked to his case. The next genetic marker silenced the lab. 46% of the profile matched Harold Kinney. This did not mean the DNA belonged to Harold Kinney himself. It meant the sample came from someone closely related to him, possibly a child, cousin, nephew, or other close blood relative. In the 1990s, this information would have been almost impossible to interpret due to technical limitations, but in 2024, MPS could distinguish between a suspect's DNA and that of a first or second-degree relative. When the data revealed characteristic duplicated markers, ones commonly shared within families, the experts immediately confirmed the person who left the DNA in the car, near the time it sank, was related by blood to Harold Kinney. This was a major turning point. If the DNA had been Harold Kinney's, they could have questioned whether he had driven the car the night the sedan disappeared. But since it was not his, yet belonged to someone close to him, the case instantly opened 2 new possibilities. One, a relative or very close associate of Kinney had used the car around the time Marcus vanished. 2, or that same person was the critical link in getting the car into the river. The lead investigator immediately ordered the Kinney family demographic files opened. Harold Kinney had a short list of relatives, but the most notable was a nephew named Luke Kinney, who lived in the same area as his uncle in the late 1980s. Luke had a petty theft conviction in 1989, had been questioned in a 1991 disturbance, and abruptly moved out of Illinois shortly afterward. Nothing in the old files tied Luke to the Marcus case, but nothing proved he was entirely uninvolved either. Another notable detail: the year Marcus disappeared, Luke was around 19 years old enough to be involved in shady activity, yet young enough to drive an older sedan. The degraded car DNA was not sufficient to confirm it could belong to someone from the second generation of the Kinney bloodline. This led investigators to a new hypothesis. Perhaps Harold Kinney was not directly involved, but someone in his family, or someone very close to him, had used the car the night Marcus vanished. That fit with something the original files had overlooked. No witness ever reported seeing Harold Kinney in the area at the time Marcus disappeared, but there were descriptions of a younger figure in the sedan. Until now, no one knew who was behind the wheel, but the DNA was starting to point them toward the answer. The lab's final report concluded, sample DNA does not belong to Marcus Hill. Sample DNA is not that of Harold Kinney. Sample DNA shows high similarity to a first or second degree relative of Harold Kinney. The lead investigator looked at the report, then at the photo of a young Marcus Hill on the wall, and said something that silenced the entire team. We're no longer just investigating Harold Kinney, we're investigating the circle of people around him. And one of them knows exactly what happened to Marcus. With these DNA results, the Marcus Hill case, thought to have been dormant for 3 decades, took another powerful step forward. For the first time, suspicion was no longer centered solely on the sedan, but expanded to the people, those with a blood connection to Harold Kinney, who might hold the key to the entire mystery. The ultra-degraded DNA did not match Marcus, and instead showed high similarity to a first or second degree relative of Harold Kinney, forcing the cold case unit to return to the most critical starting point, one that no one had truly re-examined in 3 decades, Harold Kinney's own 1990 statement to police. A flood of questions emerged. Why was his car at the bottom of the river? Why was the license plate dumped somewhere else? And why was a relative's DNA inside the submerged car right around the time Marcus disappeared? Every investigative path pointed to one place. It was time to re-examine every word Harold Kinney had ever said to police in 1990. The 1990 file recorded that Kinney claimed he was working the evening shift when Marcus vanished. The young investigator tasked with digitizing the files admitted that when he first read the original statement, it felt hard to believe, not because Kinney was obviously lying, but because the statement was too perfect, concise, contradiction-free, and almost deliberately avoiding any detail that might raise suspicion. But when those transcripts were fed into an AI timeline analysis system, that perfection quickly collapsed into a series of major and minor inconsistencies. Kinney said he worked from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., yet when cross-checked against the old time clock records from the factory where he worked, the cold case unit discovered something shocking news. He did not work the evening shift at all during the week Marcus disappeared. Worse, the record showed Kinney had taken that exact night off, the only night he missed in the entire month. This destroyed the entire timeline police in 1990 had relied on to clear him as a suspect. Continuing through, Kinney's phone records revealed another contradiction. He claimed he was home from 2 a.m. until noon the next day, but a neighbor's phone log noted loud noise coming from Kinney's garage at 5:40 a.m., the precise window, according to river current experts, when the sedan could have been pushed into the river. An older investigator reviewing a 1990 officer's handwritten notes sighed and said, "They just believed him, no follow-up checks at all." And that was the frightening truth. In 1990, police removed Kinney from the suspect list after an interview that lasted less than 20 minutes. No verification of his time card, no verification of his activities that night, no scene analysis tied to him. Why was it so easy? As the cold case unit dug deeper, another layer surfaced. The 1990 case officer had personally known Kinney's younger brother. There was no proof of a cover-up, but the fact that Kinney was interviewed only once and immediately cleared was inexplicably irregular. When the team analyzed Kinney's actual statement using AI for tone and language patterns, it flagged 3 clear instances of question dodging. 1. He avoided every question about relatives. 2. He never clarified who was allowed to borrow his car. 3. He avoided mentioning the riverfront route, where the sedan was later found. The original statement didn't even address whether he ever lent the car to anyone, though that was a standard question in any vehicle-related interview. This became especially critical once the new DNA showed a relative had been in the car. When police in 1990 asked Kinney if anyone else used his vehicle, he answered, "No, it's my car and I keep it." Yet 1989 DMV records showed Kinney had added supplemental insurance for an additional driver, Luke Kinney, his nephew, the same person the degraded car DNA could belong to. At that moment, the truth began to surface. Kinney had concealed the fact that someone else drove his car. That didn't just make his 1990 statement false, it raised far greater suspicion. Why hide it? Every answer pointed to disturbing conclusions, but the revelations didn't stop there. When the AI system examined the period Kinney claimed he was home all night, it uncovered another anomaly. Kinney said his house lights were still on at 9 p.m., yet experimental 1990 satellite imagery, stored in low spectrum, showed the Kinney residence completely dark from approximately 8:20 p.m. to 11 p.m. Once again, his statement did not match objective evidence. One investigator exclaimed, "This isn't an empty statement, it's a statement crafted to appear empty." From this, the cold case unit reached three critical conclusions. 1. Kinney was either present or indirectly involved with the car the night Marcus disappeared. 2. Kinney concealed who had used the car, most likely the relative who left the DNA. 3. His removal from the 1990 suspect list was completely unsupported, and possibly the result of sloppy handling or personal connections. When the lead investigator presented the report to command, he said something that silenced the room. "If we had looked at this properly from the start, this case wouldn't have dragged on for 34 years. Based on that report, the police department made it official. Harold Kinney was reinstated as a prime suspect, and this time he would not walk away from it easily. But one huge question remained unanswered. If Kinney had lied for 34 years, what exactly was he hiding, and who was he protecting? Once the cold case unit finished analyzing Harold Kinney's statement and officially returned him to the suspect list, they prepared for the next step, locating old witnesses. Even though after 34 years the odds of anyone remembering anything significant were virtually zero. Sometimes, however, the sheer weight of time drags the truth back to the surface in ways no one expects. One morning in June 2024, the lead investigator received a call from an elderly man living in Granite City. His voice trembled slightly, but was resolute. "I think I saw something that night. The boy disappeared. I never dared say anything. But now I can't take it to my grave." The man's name was Walter Gibbons, age 67, and he had lived in the neighborhood, near the alley Marcus walked through. He was not one of the three main 1990 witnesses, or at least his name never appeared in any recorded file. But when the team went to meet him, he opened with a sentence that left everyone frozen. "I saw that boy, not walking. He was being forced into a car." According to Gibbons, on the night Marcus vanished, he was sitting in his backyard smoking, a habit to escape the summer heat, when he heard noises, not loud screams but thumps, shoes scraping on gravel, and a low urgent voice giving orders. He walked to the fence, peered through a gap in the boards, and saw two figures next to a light-colored long-bodied car. One of them shoved someone into the back seat, and in the flickering streetlight, he clearly saw the terrified face looking back toward the alley, Marcus Hill. Gibbons said the boy didn't scream, only struggled in desperate silence, as if his voice had been silenced, or he had been threatened. One of the two men slammed the door, the car revved up and sped off south, the exact direction where, decades later, sonar would locate the sedan under the Mississippi. The investigator immediately asked, "Why didn't you come forward in 1990? Gibbons stared at the floor for a long time before answering. He said the neighborhood was chaotic back then, violence was rising, and he feared for his family. He had heard rumors about the Kinney family, that they had caused trouble in the area, that there had been prior conflicts with residents. He didn't know details, but he admitted, "I was afraid of retaliation. I was afraid they'd find out I saw." That fear was so great, he told police who canvassed days later, that he hadn't seen anything. For years afterward, he lived with crushing guilt, the image of Marcus being forced into the car, an open wound. Now, hearing the cold case had been reopened, that police had recovered the sedan from the river, and were again looking at the Kinney family, he knew it was time to tell the truth. The most remarkable part was not just the statement itself, but the astonishing corroboration with the new forensic data. Gibbons described a light-colored long metal-bodied car that reflected the streetlights, matching the confirmed Ford Ltd Crown Victoria. He said the left rear door was slammed hard, and forensics showed the left rear window had been broken from the inside, consistent with a struggle or forced entry. He remembered the car, heading south, exactly where the car was found in the Mississippi. He recalled 2 men, and MPS placed a Kinney relative's DNA in the vehicle, meaning at least one person besides Harold had been inside around that time. And the most critical match, the timing of the noises and the car leaving matched the gap in Kinney's timeline, when his house was dark, according to satellite data. When the investigator laid out all these overlapping facts to the team, no one doubted the new statement's value anymore. It wasn't just the missing piece, it was the direct link between Marcus the sedan and whoever was driving it. More importantly, Gibbons' account changed the entire nature of the case. For 34 years there had been no proof Marcus was taken by force. Theories that the victim ran away, got lost, or left voluntarily had lingered in the file. Now they were gone. This testimony eliminated every misdirection the case had suffered. It proved Marcus did not disappear on his own, or leave willingly. He was forced into a car connected to Harold Kinney's circle. That shifted the case from unexplained disappearance to abduction with fatal outcome. When Walter Gibbons signed his official statement, his hand shook slightly, but his eyes looked lighter than they had in decades. "I should have spoken up long ago," he said, "but if my words help that boy get justice, at least I no longer have to carry this weight." The Cold Case Unit's closing report that day read, "New witness statement is fully consistent with current forensic data. This is the strongest eyewitness evidence to date, sufficient to connect Marcus Hill to Harold Kinney's vehicle and Kinney's relatives. The statement solidifies the foundation for prosecution, and this was only the beginning of what would come next." When Walter Gibbons' statement was officially recorded, and the forensic results powerfully reinforced the investigation's focus on Harold Kinney and his relatives, the Cold Case Unit immediately prepared the paperwork for search warrants and an arrest warrant. But before the process could be finalized, an unexpected development occurred, one that showed Kinney not only sensed the noose tightening around him, but was prepared to flee. On the morning of August 14, 2024, an officer monitoring local activity reported that Kinney had canceled his lease, submitted utility shut-off requests, and scheduled a small moving service. DMV records also showed he had filed a change of address form to a P.O. box in Arkansas, a common tactic used to mask an actual residence. The lead investigator received the news at 7:12 a.m. He set the file down and said only one sentence, "He's running." The arrest warrant had not yet been signed, but if Kinney crossed state lines out of Illinois, recapture would become exponentially harder, especially since he had lived quietly for years and could likely count on family support. The Cold Case Unit immediately contacted the U.S. Marshals Service, the agency that specializes in fugitives preparing to flee across state borders. Within 3 hours, marshals had sealed the main exits from Cahokia Heights and posted 2 surveillance teams, one on the road leading to I-55, the other near a parking lot where Kinney had been seen loading belongings into an old pickup truck. At 9:43 a.m., Kinney appeared. He was driving a brown pickup registered to his younger brother. In the bed were 4 cardboard boxes, a large duffel bag, and something that instantly raised red flags for the marshals: 2 5-gallon gas cans of gasoline, not typical for a normal move, but very common for someone planning to travel far without stopping. As Kinney turned onto the main road, the marshals moved in. An unmarked SUV cut across his front, while another blocked the rear. In under 8 seconds, Kinney was face down on the pavement, handcuffed, and read his Miranda rights. The post-arrest report noted, suspect offered no resistance, but appeared panicked, and repeatedly asked, "Who told you people anything?" This indicates the suspect was aware of the ongoing investigation. While Kinney was being transported, the Cold Case Unit simultaneously executed the search warrant at his residence. The house was small and modest, but what they found inside made investigators' hair stand on end. In the garage was an old toolbox bearing unusual rust patterns that matched the type of metal corrosion found in the sedan's trunk. Another container held torn vehicle documents, including a photocopy of the registration for a Ford Ltd Crown Victoria, Kinney's car, even though in 1990 he had repeatedly claimed he threw out all the paperwork because the car was old and no longer used. In the bedroom, under the bottom drawer of a dresser, the search team located a canvas bag containing 3 notable items: a handkerchief embroidered with the initials LK, matching his nephew Luke Kinney, a bent ignition key for an Ltd Marquis Series vehicle, and a heavily oxidized metal lighter, with abnormal burn marks along the edge, possibly from contact with flammable liquid. None of the items was direct proof of murder, but together they completely demolished Kinney's 1990 claim that he kept nothing related to that car, and that no one in the family ever used it. The basement yielded an even more critical discovery: an old wooden box containing metal fragments, later identified by technicians as the remnants of a disassembled license plate frame. The coincidence was overwhelming. The plate itself had been tossed into the river, while the frame that held it to the car was hidden in Kinney's house. This proved one thing clearly: removing the plate was not the act of a car thief, but of someone who owned the vehicle or had direct access to it. At that moment, every piece of evidence converged on a single point: Harold Kinney knew far more than he had admitted for 34 years. Yet the most important outcome of that day was not the physical evidence, it was a legal reality. The Marcus Hill case finally had an official suspect. Kinney was brought into the station, his face frozen like stone. When investigators placed before him the photograph of the license plate recovered from the Mississippi and the image of the sedan rising from the water, he stared in silence. But that silence was no longer meaningless. It was the silence of a man who had finally been exposed, of someone who knew the circle had closed. From that moment forward, Harold Kinney was no longer just a name in a cold case file. He became the center of an active criminal investigation, and the path to the final truth had opened. Harold Kinney's trial began in early March 2025, in courtroom 4 of the St. Clair County Courthouse. The public gallery was packed from the moment the doors opened, not because Kinney was famous, but because this was the case the East St. Louis community had waited 34 years to see answered. What had once been a scattered dormant file with faint leads had become a massive case file, combining modern forensics, new witness testimony, and physical evidence recovered from the bottom of the Mississippi River. The prosecutor opened with a powerful statement: "We will prove that Harold Kinney did not merely conceal the truth, he played a direct role in the disappearance of Marcus Hill." Then they presented a summary that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The forensic presentation began with the 1990 security camera footage, restored by AI to clarify the movement of the mystery sedan. Though the plate was unreadable, analysts showed the car deliberately slowed and circled the neighborhood twice at the exact time Marcus vanished. Next came the 2005 VHS tape, projected on modern equipment. Reflections on the plate revealed an Illinois 1987-1993 series, matching Kinney's vehicle, and the taillight pattern was identical to a Ford Ltd Crown Victoria. Then the actual plate pulled from the river was displayed, its layered sediment, proving it had lain there since 1990. A geologist testified that the silica pattern along the edges could not have formed in just a few years. The plate was placed on the evidence table beside the rusted frame recovered from Kinney's basement. The 2 pieces fit together perfectly, like a key sliding into its lock. When the salvage footage of the mud-covered sedan rising from the water was shown, the prosecutor moved to the detailed forensics: left rear window broken from the inside, ignition tampered with, rear seat showing drag marks, floor dents consistent with shoe kicks, and degraded DNA in the cabin belonging to a close Kinney relative. This was not an accident, the forensic expert concluded. This vehicle was intentionally sunk, possibly with someone still inside. While the gallery was still reeling, the prosecution turned to the MPS DNA evidence. The lab expert explained how next-generation sequencing extracted readable profiles from samples that would have been useless in the 1990s. The DNA is not Marcus Hill's, it is not Harold Kinney's, but it shares 46% of markers with him, consistent with a first or second-degree relative. Jurors scribbled so fast their pens clattered. The final DNA piece nailed the argument. A close relative of Kinney's had been inside the car when it was disposed of. Next, the state called Walter Gibbons. Despite his age and frail health, he walked to the stand unaided. When he rose leaning on the rail, the courtroom fell so quiet the rustle of paper could be heard. Gibbons recounted the night in 1990, Marcus forced into the back seat of a light-colored sedan under flickering streetlights. The door slammed, the car speeding south. "I stayed silent out of fear," he said, voice breaking. "But I remember clearly, that boy did not get in willingly. It wasn't chance, it wasn't running away, it was forced." The prosecutor asked, "Is the car you saw the same as this vehicle?" pointing to the screen showing the recovered sedan. Gibbons nodded immediately. Same in a way I can never forget." To bolster the testimony, the state called a behavioral analyst, who demonstrated the near-perfect alignment between Gibbons' account and the forensic record, left rear door broken outward, route matching the car's discovery site, and timing matching the period. Kinney's house was dark according to 1990 satellite data. Everything locked together like the final links in a chain. Only then did the defense rise. Kinney's attorney argued there was no direct evidence. Kinney himself forced Marcus into the car, that the DNA could belong to anyone who used the car in the 1980s, that the plate could have been thrown by someone else, and that Gibbons' memory after 34 years was unreliable. But every argument collapsed when the prosecution countered with the AI-verified timeline. Kinney's time card proved he did not work the night shift. He claimed, "Power records showed his house dark during the abduction window. Neighbor notes documented garage noise at 5:40 a.m. The exact river current window for sinking the car. The physical items from Kinney's house, torn registration papers, rusted plate frame, toolbox with matching corrosion, were facts no defense strategy could explain away." The attorney's last stand was, "No one saw Harold Kinney driving that night." The prosecutor replied, "That's because he made sure no one did. But the forensics did." The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning. Harold Kinney was directly involved in the disappearance of Marcus Hill. The full truth was still not known, but the court no longer doubted that Kinney participated in concealing the vehicle, concealing the person involved, and providing false statements to derail the 1990 investigation. When the verdict was read, Kinney showed no emotion, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, never lifting once. In that moment, everyone in the room felt the same thing. After 34 years, the Marcus Hill case finally had the answer the family and community had waited for, and justice was closer than ever. When the jury declared Harold Kinney directly involved in Marcus Hill's disappearance, the shockwave from the verdict spread faster than anyone in the cold case unit could have imagined. This was not simply the end of a 35-year-old case, it was the end of an investigative era that had left too many gaps, too many oversights, and too many mistakes never spoken of. The next day, the Illinois State Police held a large press conference. The cold case unit commander stood beside the chief, while in front of dozens of reporters, they released a 60-plus page document, Internal Review Report, Marcus Hill Case 1990-2025. For the first time in Illinois law enforcement history in Illinois, an internal review was released almost unredacted, no names protected, no sections cut. Its contents left the East St. Louis community speechless. The report opened with one sentence: "The Marcus Hill investigation failed in its very first hours." Then, one by one, every error was listed in stark detail, making it clear the entire 1990 investigation had been shaped by a chain of grave mistakes. First error: Harold Kinney was removed from the suspect list after an 18-minute interview. The 1990 record showed the interviewing officer asked Kinney only 7 questions, all open-ended, none requiring documentation, none cross-checking timelines, none examining vehicle records, none inquiring about relatives who had access to the car. The report described it in one word: negligent. Second error: no one verified Kinney's time card, even though the factory had a complete punch clock system that night. Third error: 2 neighbors' initial statements about hearing noise near Kinney's garage around 5 a.m. were misplaced and never entered into the master file. Fourth error: The alley behind the neighborhood was never searched, despite 2024 AI analysis showing it as the most likely abduction route. Fifth error. Evidence was stored improperly, causing Marcus's bracelet recovered in an illogical location, but never re-examined. The report stated plainly, in 1990, the Marcus Hill case was treated as a runaway, rather than an abduction. Every subsequent decision rested on that wrong assumption. But what outraged the press and public most was the answer to the biggest question: why was Kinney cleared so quickly? The internal review revealed a bombshell. The 1990 interviewing officer Michael Roach had a personal relationship with Kinney's younger brother. They fished together and had lived in the same neighborhood for years. In his 2024 statement, Roach admitted he didn't want to make a big deal and couldn't believe Harold would do something bad. There was no evidence Roach deliberately covered up a crime, but his personal bias caused him to skip basic investigative steps, and that single choice destroyed the case from day one. When this became public, East St. Louis erupted in anger. People could not accept that one officer's small personal bias, one gut feeling, not evidence, had silenced a 17-year-old boy's case for 35 years. Marcus's family, now only a few surviving relatives, sat in the front row of the press conference. His grandmother had died long ago without ever knowing the truth, but Marcus's sister, now a mother in her 40s, wept openly reading the line. The 1990 investigating agency failed to protect Marcus Hill. We accept full responsibility for that failure. Following the report, the state of Illinois announced sweeping reforms in missing persons protocols, using the Marcus Hill case as the example of what must never happen again. Reform 1. Every missing person under 18 is automatically classified missing endangered juvenile, regardless of circumstances, eliminating the runaway assumption, absent clear proof. Reform 2. Any suspect linked to a vehicle must undergo full interrogation and schedule verification with documentation, time cards, cameras, indirect witnesses. Reform 3. All cold cases will be digitized and AI analyzed for inconsistencies, gaps, and past errors. Reform 4. State evidence rooms will adopt new standardized storage protocols to prevent loss or degradation. Reform 5. Any officer with a personal relationship to a suspect or family must immediately recuse themselves. No exceptions. In the letter to the governor, the cold case commander wrote, "Had these procedures existed in 1990, Marcus Hill would have been found, or at least the truth would have surfaced 3 decades sooner." The case's impact went beyond government offices. The East St. Louis community, long feeling Marcus had been forgotten, now saw the case as a turning point. Volunteer groups created funds for missing persons' families, schools held teen safety forums, newspapers statewide ran series on systemic failure, exposed by the case. Candlelight vigils for Marcus continued every weekend for 3 months. People said that after 35 years, Marcus Hill had finally regained his voice. At the end of the press conference, the lead investigator said words that brought many to tears. "We cannot bring Marcus back, but we can make sure no other child in Illinois is ever forgotten the way Marcus was." 6 weeks after the verdict, the Marcus Hill case file was officially closed, not for lack of evidence or interest, but because justice had finally completed its 35-year journey. Yet in the hearts of East St. Louis residents, the case will never truly end. It became a reminder: the truth can be buried in mud, hidden in lies, obscured by human failing, but it never disappears. And one day, like the Sudan rising from the bottom of the Mississippi, the truth will surface unstoppable. Looking back at the Marcus Hill disappearance in East St. Louis, the most haunting part is not just the Sudan pulled from the bottom of the Mississippi, or the rusted license plate tossed into the river in 1990. But the way an entire system let a 17-year-old boy simply slip away from the protection it was supposed to provide. In today's America, that story is not only a tragedy of the past, it is a stark reminder: if we stay silent, if we just take someone's word and move on, the way the officer accepted Harold Kinney's 18-minute statement and cleared him as a suspect, the price can stretch across decades. In a modern United States where MPS can pull ultra-degraded DNA from a car submerged for decades, where AI can restore 1990 security footage and 2005 VHS tapes, technology has done its part. It pieced together the plate, the sediment layers, the Kinney family relative DNA traces, and the new testimony from Walter Gibbons, who watched Marcus being forced into the back seat. But human beings remain the weakest link: personal bias, half-hearted procedures, and the lazy assumption that he probably just ran away, killed the chance to save a child. The lesson for life in America today is this: every single person has to be an active layer of protection. If you're the neighbor who hears strange noises in the alley, if you see a car creeping slowly through the neighborhood, if you're a witness like Gibbons was back then, silence out of fear or reluctance to get involved can turn into 35 years of waiting for justice. If you work inside the system, police, teachers, social workers, Marcus's story screams that missing people can no longer be treated as numbers or cases, but as human beings with names, families, and futures. And for all of us watching and listening, the final lesson is: never let another Marcus have to wait a lifetime simply because we chose silence during the most critical 18 minutes. If you believe stories like the Marcus Hill case need to be told all the way to the end, so no one is ever forgotten, please hit subscribe to walk this road with us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue the journey to bring justice to those left behind.